This program is funded by Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. And now I'd like to introduce Carolyn Holbrook, founder and director of More Than a Single Story and valued partner of Hennepin County Library. Carolyn will introduce our panelists today and moderate the panel event as well. Welcome, Caroline, and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Kia. And many thanks to Hennepin County Libraries for being our valued partner as well. And thanks also to the panelists for participating in today's program, and also to those of you who decided to spend your afternoon with us. Welcome. More Than a Single Story is a Twin Cities-based public conversation series where Black, Indigenous, and people of color writers, artists, and activists discuss issues of importance to us. Our goal is to provide a forum that strengthens our abilities to work together around cross-cultural understanding and to add to the discussions of empowerment in and for our communities. We are pleased with our ongoing partnerships with Hennepin Libraries, Friends of the St. Paul Library, the Loft Literary Center, and our other partners as well. And we're extremely grateful to the voters of Minnesota for grants from the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council and the Minnesota State Arts Board, excuse me, and for support from other foundations. All of this allows us to keep our programs going. We recently published an anthology with the University of Minnesota Press, We Are Meant to Rise, Voices for Justice from Minneapolis to the World. It features 33 BIPOC writers who speak to the events of the last 2 years, the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd and its aftermath. But there are also essays and poems about loss, family, food culture, economic security, mental health, and other issues. For more information about the book and to find out when and where More Than a Single Story is doing events, please visit our website, which will be in the chat periodically. So today's topic, as Kia mentioned, is centered around home and exile. As we are well aware, immigrants and refugees often come to the United States because they were traumatized in their homeland. Many end up in Minnesota. Sometimes they were uprooted overnight and find themselves in a land that is strange to them. How do they make new lives for themselves in this new land? And though they find ways to make homes out of necessity, do they ever really find home? Today, I'm excited to be in conversation with 4 of those people. Ayaan Adan is a Somali author and award-winning user experience designer and community organizer. Her newest book, Daughters of Arawillo, Stories of Somali Women, was released by Minnesota Historical Society Press just this February. Tessa Bridal was born and raised in Uruguay and is the author of 3 novels and 2 nonfiction books. Her newest book is The Dark Side of Memory, Uruguay's Disappeared Children and the Families That Never Stopped Searching. Ahmad Qais Munhazim is a perpetually displaced queer gender Afghan Muslim. They're an assistant professor excuse me, of global studies at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. They have published poems, essays, articles in many places, including our anthology, We Are Meant to Rise. Terri Thao is passionate about building power with community. She is currently a program director for the local Giving and Opportunities program at Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies. She has spent her professional career in the fields of community economic development, community building, leadership development, and philanthropy. She also teaches classes on leadership and advocacy at Metropolitan State University. So before we begin, More Than a Single Story always likes to start our public conversations with a poem based on the topic of the day's conversation. And Terri Thao will be reading today's poem. Welcome, Terri.
Thank you, Carolyn. Today I've decided to choose a poem that was written by my friend, a local Hmong American poet named Mei Li Yang, who really speaks to how she's navigating the world as a Hmong American girl and woman and the patriarchy. It's called Advice for My Unborn Child, or How to Survive as a Hmong Girl. Talk back, stay up late, don't do the dishes, eat pizzas and cakes, say huh when people ask you things in Hmong. And when that man approaches you, sometimes he is your age, sometimes he is as old as your father, sometimes he disguises himself as a savior, college graduate, an only son, a Christian, a suburbanite, a white man, even a Black one. Be wary. I've seen good girls go down. They smile back. They give out real phone numbers. They sneak out during the daytime. They start framing you for work undone. Next thing you know, you, the bad girl, are the one staying at home, reading, doing homework, while she, the good girl, deteriorates into something you've only seen on TV. Soon, the good girl marries, gets pregnant, or perhaps it is the other way around. But she is stuck in that hole that she works so hard to get out of, the hole that people like us are born into. It is hard to dig oneself out of that hole with manicured nails and high heels. Worse, a man who continues to shove dirt so that no matter how much she digs, she remains stuck, rooted like a grand oak tree, something we admire from afar but can never transplant. For she is destined to remain in this place. You, who have yet to be born, will never have to touch dirt. But you cannot forget your past. You cannot trick yourself into believing you are separate from us. You cannot return as a savior. That is the trick of it. How can you know your history and also be free of it? Thank you.
Wow, that's powerful. And I love the last line. How can you know your history and be free of it? That's, thank you so much, Terri. So I'm going to ask all of you okay, first of all, I gave the very brief introductions for each of you. So could you please just tell us more about yourself and your work as a writer and or your work in the community or your university? And whoever would like to can start.
Hello, everyone. First and foremost, thank you, Carolyn, for putting this wonderful event together, and thank you to Hennepin County Library. Carolyn already gave a wonderful introduction, but I thought I'd talk a little bit about my book. So I released Daughters of Arawela earlier this year, and it's a collection of 14 stories of 3 generations of women, of Somali women here in Minnesota. The reason I wrote this book is because so often the stories I've read about the Somali community or Somali women in general have been really linked to violence or crime or trauma, and I don't think that that fully paints a picture of our experience. And so I grew up here listening to people's stories and, being raised by Somali people and in Somali culture, and there's a beauty and a resilience that I recognize that I wasn't recognizing in media or stories about us. And so I wanted to paint those layers and tell a story for an audience that goes a little deeper. The title of the book, Daughters of Arawela. Arawela is a contested figure in Somali mythology, whether she existed or not, and she's also quite polarizing. And so her name is sometimes used as a tease for stubborn girls. And so I wanted to pay homage to that, and I wanted to borrow a bit of her fame and the popularity and her recognition that her name holds in the Somali community to tell the story of these resilient, amazing women. And so I'm really excited to talk more about that. And I also want to share that part of why I was inspired, and a really, really strong part of it, is by Carolyn, who was my professor, and the work that she's done, and especially around her series of More Than a Single Story. And so it all comes really full circle here. So thank you again.
And I am so proud of you, Ayaan. As I've said a million times. Yeah, and the book is wonderful. So I encourage everyone to pick up a copy and read it if you haven't already.
Hello, everybody. My name is Terri Thao. I am, there was my formal bio that Carolyn generously read, but I also wanted to share today that I'm the oldest daughter of an oldest daughter of an eldest daughter with a firstborn who is also a daughter. So I come from a generation of firstborn girls. I'm the oldest in my family, which means you have a lot of responsibility on you. And I translated that into the community work that I do now today. So really glad to be here with you all today. Happy to be in relationship with all the amazing things that are happening at the Hennepin County Libraries. And libraries are very near and dear to me because as a second gen, a child of refugees, libraries are really the few places that we were allowed to go to as young people. and writing and reading was one of the few things that was affordable and we were allowed to do. So I'm really glad to be here with everybody here today and the talent here today. But I do a lot of community work. So that's where folks will see me out and about.
Grateful and excited that you're here with us today. That goes for everyone. So it looks like Tessa is still, okay, you've unmuted. Okay, go ahead.
Yes. I want to add my thanks to Caroline for inviting me to be a part of this panel today. It's a pleasure to be on with all of you. I am doing this from Uruguay, from my native country in South America. And I just have come out of last night of doing the march, the annual march for the disappeared. And we have had thousands of people disappear during the 1970s at the height of the Cold War in South America. And we were about 25,000 people yesterday marching down the main avenue of Montevideo, Uruguay's capital city. And my book deals, The Dark Side of Memory, deals primarily with the appropriation of children at the time when their parents were arrested for what were considered subversive or anti-military government acts. And some of them are still missing, but most of them have been found. And so the book focuses on the extraordinary courage and determination of the mothers and grandmothers who looked for them sometimes for decades. The oldest child, who was not a child obviously, but he was found when he was in his mid-20s. So, and I was with his mother yesterday and marched with her. So that's my little intro. Thank you.
Thank you, Tessa. Thank you for being here as well. And wow, you go down there every year for the march?
I don't come every year, no.
Mm-hmm.
No, but I didn't want to miss it this year just when the book had come out. So
Exactly. Yeah, it's quite an interesting book. All of these books are just fascinating. Okay, Qais, please.
Thank you so much for organizing this, and I'm very happy and delighted to share this afternoon with you all. I will start with a poem, since this is on subject of home. And earlier, Terri's poem also reminded me of this poem. So I was like, oh, let me read this. It's called Home. You remind me of my birth, the first steps I took, the tremble and the fall, the rising back. You remind me of the first time I laughed with my heart, jumping like it was gonna stop. Or the first time I remember I cried, under those broken stairs hiding from bombs drop. You remind me of the times I danced, wrapped with floral fabrics, purple, pink, and white. You remind me of the long winter nights, all of us around a shaky lamp, telling tales of 1001 night, love, laugh, and try. You remind me of the last time I felt alive, home. My home is Afghanistan. I was born and raised in Afghanistan. Currently, I'm based in Philadelphia. I'm an assistant professor of global studies. But my second home is Minneapolis, where I actually lived for a decade of my life. It was a place that took me through my education journey, but I also made friends and family and queer community and queer kinship in St. Paul and Minneapolis. It's very close to my heart. Although I also lived almost a decade of my life in Pakistan in refugee camps. So that's why I'm perpetually displaced, because I always grapple with the meaning and notion of home since I haven't actually lived in a place for longer for 10 years. And now with the return of Taliban and betrayal of the international community of Afghans and Afghanistan overall, the past 20 years of war, My whole community and family, they're all displaced now. They're living in different refugee camps everywhere. A larger number of queer and trans people are also in different borders and places. I am a queer Muslim and Afghan, and all of that is very central to the things that I write, the things that I research. And I'm very happy here to share from my own experiences and struggles with the notion of exile and also home, and also hear from everybody else. I'm very delighted for this invite. Thank you so much, Caroline, for always believing in me, but also creating this community that brings very resilient and brave people together.
Thank you for always being available and for submitting that beautiful piece that you submitted to our anthology, and for just being you, all of you. Thank you so much. So Minneapolis and St. Paul has the largest population of Somali and Hmong people in the US. Can each of you talk just a little bit about how you ended up in Minnesota?
Well, I'm happy to share. So I was born here. My family was one of the first ones to come to the United States in Chicago, actually in '76. And so, and then due to US, there were reunification laws of this country allowed family members to sponsor other family members. So that's how the communities grew. And we moved to Minnesota and was part of that secondary migration wave in the early, mid to late 80s, because 1, there was family here, 2, there were jobs, and 3, there was affordable housing. And so those factors really allowed the community to grow. And then my family did things like invest in businesses along University Avenue, and we owned a business. So I grew up working for my family's business as a kid, young person, 13. And so, and again, as people saw that there was possibility and growth here and family, that's why they all ended up, particularly in St. Paul, and then of course grew to in Minneapolis as well, and then now are living in the suburbs, and it's a highly dense population now. So, and it's been really interesting, my observations about second gen life growing up as a Hmong American. And it's even different now for my children who are third, as well as some of the younger generations too. And I'd just love to share a little bit more about that later.
Looking forward to hearing about that, the differences in the generations. Ayaan, why don't you go next?
Yeah, for sure. I would say a large number of Somali immigrants came to the United States and across the world, actually in different countries as well, left Somalia because of the civil war of '91 that destabilized the country, threw it into chaos, and a lot of people fled for safety, for opportunity, for education, and many other reasons. A large number came to Minnesota, and particularly Minneapolis and St. Paul, which now is the largest, which now has the largest population of Somali diaspora in the world, and because of that, I think more people have come over. Part of the reason why Minnesota, why Minneapolis, is because there was, I think, a relationship with the Catholic Charities that helped sponsor folks. And I know a lot of people ask that question because Somalia is a very warm place and Minnesota can be very cold, but it adds up once you look a little farther back. And since then, Somalis have been, I think, really quite resilient, but also entrepreneurial. If you look at Lake Street, if you go to 24 Mall, different areas like that, you'll see a lot of little shops, people, creating businesses and finding a way to create a living and support their families. And I think that has only grown. And in my book, I talk about how some people did come here after the Civil War, but there was also a generation of people who came here before that, seeking education and opportunity, and the way that maybe they view home and the relationship to Minnesota or what home means for them might be a little different too. So.
And I also remember reading in your book that several people in your book talked about, how their families had like Terri, grown up in other states and then migrated to Minnesota. So,
That's absolutely right. Yeah, some people were, I don't know, I'm forgetting the word for it, but when they first came to the States, they went to Virginia or Tennessee, but a lot of people eventually came to Minnesota because of the large Somali community, the opportunities, the education, and I think honestly, really that community,
mhm,
which can make it feel a little less lonely being in
yeah,
the country.
yeah. Okay, thank you. Qais, how did you end up in Minnesota?
Yeah, that's a question that I always get whenever I tell people, even when now that I'm on the East Coast, that I lived in Minneapolis. Like, how did you end up from Afghanistan in Minneapolis? It was just by luck, and also I think Minnesota was calling me to come, and I believe in that. When a place really wants you, things just happen, and I got a scholarship. This was 2008, and things were still not as bad as you see now in Afghanistan. Especially I was young and very, very hopeful for the future and my own future in Afghanistan. And I was like so happy to be back after so many years in Pakistan, to be where a place that I could speak my own language. Nobody asked me why am I here. And then all of a sudden scholarships started coming. I actually was attending American University in Kabul for a year. And I was sitting in the cafeteria waiting for my friend to finish something he was writing on the computer so that we can go and eat. And he told me to go ahead and fill out a form for the US. There's a scholarship. And I was like, no, I'm not interested to go anywhere. I'm happy here. And he was like, well, you're annoying me because I kept saying finish. Why don't you just fill out that form and send it? Maybe we'll both end up together somewhere in the US. And I filled it out. It took me 45 minutes. And then after that, it just started. Like, I got the first interview. I had to upload lots of other documents, of course, but then it took me around 8 to 9 months of different rounds of interviews, and I still wasn't believing that it's actually going to happen. But the scholarship was for five people, but then thousands of people had applied, and I was one of them that was selected. And when University of Minnesota sent me the letter, I didn't know where University of Minnesota was. So I went around. I worked for the UN at that time and asked my boss. He was American. I was like, do you know where Minnesota is? Like, oh yeah, I went to school there. And so I was like, oh, that's nice. So should I go? And he was like, yeah, you should. It's very cold. The first thing that I heard, but it's a good place. So that's how I ended up. And I remember the first day when I came from the airport to the University Village, which is on 26th Street, and I was quite surprised and afraid and scared of moving across the world, and with nothing, just a backpack and some clothes and no family and community. But the very first people that I actually made friends were the Somali community. Like, that's came in full support and love, because when I didn't know how to even use the washing machine or the doors or how to walk the street, it was Yasmin, the friend I made, who actually guided me through all of that. And so I think that's another aspect of Minnesota, that you find community, and that's what I really love about it.
That's a lovely story. I was recently talking to someone from Guatemala who came here in the summer, and she thought that this was the hottest place she'd ever lived. What did she get a surprise, right? Okay, Tessa, how did you end up in Minnesota?
Well, I ended up in Minnesota because I married a man from here, but I came to the United States when I was in my late teens with one of my sisters and my mother, and we were leaving a situation that was deteriorating very rapidly in Uruguay under the military dictatorship. And I don't believe any of us were in actual danger at that point, but well, my sister thought this would be a good time, and she was offered a job in Washington, D.C. So we moved there. And it was a very difficult adjustment for me. I was, as I say, in my late teens, and I'd grown up in a very small country. And now here I was in a very huge country. And it seemed to me that being young, being of that age here was very different to what it was like in Uruguay. The parties I would go to were completely different to the parties I had gone to as a girl and a teenager in Uruguay. And it was a difficult adjustment. But I went to work there and saved money to go to school and did that, and then met my husband and came to Minnesota. And I didn't know at the time that every state of the United States has a sister partner country in Latin America, and that Uruguay was Minnesota's. So that was kind of a nice coincidence. And I got to meet then through that organization quite a number of other Uruguayans. And so there are more of us in Minnesota than I would have thought, considering the cold weather and all. But there is a community here, and that helped make life a lot easier. We still meet, even though I have just as many Minnesotan friends as I do Uruguayan friends now, but we do still get together, eat our favorite foods, and compare notes about our kids and all those things that we love to do, exchange photographs and things. And we also have formed a group of knitters and crocheters, and we make clothing for homeless people or people in shelters. And so that's a contribution we feel we make to a community that has been very welcoming and very kind to us.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm very curious to talk to you sometime about the difference between being a teenager in Uruguay and in America. That's got to be an interesting topic.
At that time, especially, it was very different.
Okay. So I'm curious to know how you and your family members and your community members grapple with questions of identity. Some of you have talked about the similarities and differences, and how first, second, and now Terri, you also talked about third generation people in your community. How do you grapple with being in America?
I think there is, well, first, I think there is art, right? And so I appreciate my friend who I featured earlier, who was able to talk about some of the nuances, like what some of the expectations the second generation, 1.5, as well as the second generation were experiencing, right? I just came from a graduation just now, and how much promise there was for people, the expectation of education, higher education, because of its ability to move people out of poverty so quickly, right? And to be recognized, right? I think for a long time, Hmong folks as the unlanded folks, it was desire to be recognized. I think what I really love about community is we're always asking these questions. I think we always talk about how culture shifts, right? Even when I speak Hmong and the elders are like, that's not a Hmong word, that's a Lao word. It's always, they're very clear about how language is always evolving and how we're changing practices. And so what I love, and coming from an Indigenous people, is that we're always doing meaning making of our own, right? We had to make sense of the world as we knew it then. We have to make sense of it now. And so we're always in this process and of doing this analysis, right? Whether it is language, food, fashion, right? All these things. And I just think it's great. But I sometimes have to go back and convey it to my children. Like, this is how it was, this is why we do things this way, this is why we attend things like Hmong New Year and, family healing ceremonies and festivals, and so in all the ways that we act, there's just so much explanation behind it. So I think we're always doing that meaning making individually, at the family level, and at a community level. Like the amount of Facebook groups that are doing meaning making, lots. Lots.
Yeah, you mentioned, having to explain things to children, like children in second and third generation children. What do they not? Let me see. How can I ask this question? They don't understand why certain ceremonies or why you're doing this first and second generation people are doing things the way they do, or what?
Yeah, I even think it comes down to, like, my children, we live in St. Paul. They go to school with other Hmong kids. I felt like I had failed when my daughter comes home and goes, "Mommy, we're Hmong." And I was like, "Yeah, did you not?" For her, it was just, she just took it as, that's it. That's just my way of life, right? But what we didn't reinforce those stories, like how, sometimes how we came here or why it's important, why we wear the different clothing that we do, right? And so they take it for granted in different ways. We're not always telling them the story, so we have to go back and be like, well, this is why we do things this way, right? And so because for them, they just like, yep, it is what it is, right? Whereas we were all, particularly when you are an other, and it's very obvious you're an other, it's always pointed out to you right away. But they're at a point where they're not the other. They're, in some cases, the majority. So it's really fascinating what we have to do to kind of and to see how definitions will evolve for them too. There's also this sense, real quick too, before the panelists, that I think a lot of times in America, what they do to what happens with second generation is that there's this tendency to be even more Hmong than we were before, right? And so because the nature of what the United States and white supremacy does is causes us to lose culture, and so suddenly there's a hyper focus on culture. So I'm kind of enjoying this young people revival of like really embracing culture and language and practice, and so because it's definitely making a statement about how we see ourselves in the world around us.
Yeah, and it seems like the young people are also willing and interested to walk between worlds, to know, people who are not of their particular race and ethnicity, is different than it was in my generation too. Of course, I'm old as the hills, but yeah. So, Qais, how does that work, and how has it been for you and people who were from Afghanistan, and you said Pakistan as well, who are first, second, third generation? How is the difference?
It's a great question, because it also relates to my research with the Afghan diaspora in the US. So for me personally, as somebody who just came over 10 years ago to the US, so it's quite different, since I also am part of that first generation coming in out from my own family. But with the research that I've done with a lot of Afghan diaspora in different cities around the US who came here during the Cold War, 80s and 90s, and then another wave is now coming in the past year. There is, with the question of identity and the way they grapple, is what I theorize as double lives, that a lot of the second generation are living double and triple lives in terms of the way that they have to navigate their identities within the community, within their families, and outside. And that also applies to many other immigrant kids who grew up here, or they were born here, because that's the one way they actually survive. And for a lot of Muslims in general, survival becomes that sort of navigating and struggling between different identities, but also hiding some and revealing some in the ways that they also, because home is an ontological security. It's a space of where they feel safe, despite the fact that maybe they wouldn't be able to speak now with their mothers in their native language, or the mom possibly, or the parents would not maybe understand their gender and sexuality. But outside, all of that matters. Inside the home, it's the language, it's the safety, it's the community that matters. So they have really, at a very young age, learn how to navigate those different spaces and be multiple people in different places, which I also, in a way, see it as the agency that they hold. And there's power to that, because a lot of times people would see it from outside and say that that's kind of weakness. Like for me, with my own identity, like my family has no idea I'm married, of a very queer life here, and that's very private to me, because I know that my relationship with my family is beyond that, and I know that that's going to hurt them in so many ways, because they don't know about this part of the world or about me. how I have lived that. So there's so many other things that I want to remember and live with my own family. And so I see power in that. And a lot of the first and second generation, there's a lot of course, tensions, but then the second generation always is attentive in so many ways, in the ways that they don't want to hurt the first generation. They all in the Afghan community are aware that a lot of their parents sacrificed. They made a lot of, they went through a lot of pain and hurt in the process of moving and living here. They lost their careers, their language, their cultures, their community to raise these children here. So to give them back, a lot of the kids also hide certain things in order to continue those hopes in the homes.
Wow. What you said about living double and triple lives kind of makes me think of how African Americans live as well, you know, with code switching and, you know, having, being very comfortable at home and in our own community, but having to switch and become something else in the workplace and school. So yeah, it's just really interesting. Tessa, how about you?
Well, I was very fortunate when my family, or my sister and my mother, chose to come to the United States, that I had been in an English or British immersion school. So I didn't have the challenge of language that so many other people coming from different places have to deal with first thing. I at least could make myself understood and could understand what others were saying to me. But what became really very, very difficult for me was my appearance, because it was very hard for people to accept. I think it's less so now, but in those days, 50 years ago, it was very, very hard for people to accept that someone who had light skin, light eyes, light hair was from South America. And one of the things that happened to me most often was people would say, because they could hear that I had an accent, and they would say, well, where are you from? And I would say, I'm from South America, because if I said Uruguay, nobody had any idea what that was. So I started off with a continent and then narrowed it from there. But I said, I'm from South America. And what was interesting was that 9 out of 10 people heard South Africa. And so they would say, where in South Africa? And then, it came to, no, South America or whatever. But sometimes people just, I could tell that they either thought I was joking, pulling their leg, not telling the truth, or whatever, and so that became a really, really painful and hard for me. It's passed a little bit now, but it was really very difficult. And I would get comments like, oh, I thought everyone south of the border was Black. And no, we are a mixed community, just like many others. But one of the things about home and who are we, and that really struck me yesterday. I spent the afternoon with one of the mothers of the disappeared, who appears in my book, and she was telling me how difficult it is. Not that I didn't know this, but she was filling me in further about how difficult it is for their children when they are found living with another family that has illegally appropriated them, but has not necessarily treated them poorly. They have pretended or told them that they are their own biological children. And when they discover that they're not, the question was, well, where do I belong? Am I, and in the case of Uruguayan children, most of them were appropriated in Argentina. So am I from Argentina? Am I from Uruguay? Do I belong to this family that appropriated me, or do I belong to my biological family? Where very often there were big differences, different habits, different economic levels, a lot of challenges. So it gave me a lot of food for thought of, where is home then? Where is home, and who are they? Where do they belong? So And that was very striking for me yesterday when I was having these conversations with the mothers.
Really interesting and quite sad.
Yes.
Mhm. Ayaan interviewed women from age 20 to in their 90s for her book. So you, I'm sure, have heard a lot about first, second, third generation Somali immigrants and Somalis who were born here. Can you talk about the,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think even before beginning this book, I was really interested in the topic of home and what is home,
Mhm.
what makes home. And then, like you said, Carolyn, I spoke to 3 generations of Somali women. The youngest generation was born here or came here very early. Really, this is their experience. Well, this is what you'd think is their experience of home, right? The second generation is that third culture. Some of them grew up in the Middle East or in Europe, and you know, also had lived in Somalia, and came here as teenagers or maybe as young adults, and then went on to start and raise families here in the States. And the last generation are the elders who came here, who, for the most part, were born and raised in Somalia, who witnessed um, colonization, um, a brief democracy, civil war, and then eventually came to the States. And so I was really interested to hear what these women had to say about identity and also home. And so I had my own expectations of, you know, I assumed that I assumed that most people would kind of fit into these boxes that I, you know, started thinking of before writing the stories, that the elders saw home as back home. Young people had grown up here, pretty much this is all they experienced, so this is their idea of home. And I didn't know what the that middle generation would say. And instead, what I found was really like it sort of flipped its head. And then I think this is what Terri spoke to earlier, that second generation, that that longing and sort of attachment to culture and history and trying to find that way is something that was really apparent in those interviews. Everyone I spoke to, and even actually, I would say third generation, you know, kids whose kids, like young kids, and this isn't in the book, but kids whose parents were born and raised here, who they themselves had not gone home, who their parents maybe had not gone home. When you talk to them about back home, they all intrinsically know what you're talking about, and they all have that like understanding or grasping of a different home besides the one that they live in. And I thought that was really interesting. And I wanted to know, could there be, and what I found was that there was this yearning, this belonging to home the young people had for a place that they had never been in. And one person described it as meeting somebody new, but somebody that feels like a friend or somebody that you've known before. And I thought that was really poetic and beautiful. And the elders who again, for the most part, had only been here for maybe less than 10 years, who had experienced a whole life beyond this country, they felt this, some of them felt this ownership of, why. I asked a question, are you American? And they said, why not? And I think that spoke to, I think, maybe the possibility or the opportunity, and also their openness of not trying to battle both identities, but understanding maybe their reality. And I thought that was really interesting. And that middle generation was all over the place. So, I really couldn't say what one person would say, what the other person would say, but everybody had this, I think, respect and understanding of home and a desire to create home and legacy, and what that meant was different to each person. And I thought that was really beautiful. But what I my largest takeaway from that was that no two answers were the same, and that each person had their own experience and history and upbringing and emotions that informed what is home for them. And I think that's something that we can all relate to. A lot of us are, immigrants, or where we have this experience of being in two places at once. And so it complicates that definition of home and what home feels like. But we all come to our own conclusions, and they're all valid in their own way. So yeah, that was a wonderful theme, I think, to explore in the book, and I think just to hear from other people, and it definitely informed my working definition of home that is still, I think, in progress, and maybe it's true for many other people.
Yeah, and before we go any further, just listening to all of you, I'm just curious if you have questions for each other.
I was blown away by Terri, you talking about being an elder daughter, and your mother being the eldest daughter, and your grandmother being an eldest daughter. That's a lot of history, and that's a lot of, I think that's like a thread that's weaved through that, you all can relate to each other, that responsibility, and many of the women I interviewed were all eldest daughters too, and every person without, I think, me prompting them, brought up what that meant for them growing up in this country, and as an immigrant or refugee, and as a young woman. And so I really resonated with that part of your story.
Thank you. And Qais, I was just fascinated about your research. You're able to put some words to what you're seeing in the generation. So where I couldn't articulate it, thank you for finding those words.
Okay, in our planning meeting, we talked about how immigrants from some countries, especially immigrants from Black and Brown countries, are often surveilled, subjected to physical and psychological violence. They're called terrorists often. They're viewed suspiciously when trying to send money home to their families. Can you speak about how this has affected you and the people that you love, people in your community? Just how does this affect you?
I can speak to one part of that, but yeah, to everything that you've said. I think the thing that I've noticed the most out of that surveillance, the suspicion, the paranoia that creates, maybe rightful paranoia, I think what that creates is, I think it tarnishes or it weakens the bonds that community have with each other, by creating this artificial fear of one another that didn't exist before. That fear of being spied on, or of having your words or your beliefs misinterpreted or shown in a light that's not true to what you believe. And I think that weakens the bonds of an already vulnerable community. Those bonds that people rely on, that community, that the trust that people have for one another. One thing that I've always mentioned is if you're driving down the street as a Somali person, a complete stranger might flag you down and ask you for a ride to another part of the city or something like that they wouldn't ask anybody else, but they trust you because of that shared identity. And in turn, maybe you wouldn't pick up somebody, but because you see somebody that maybe is like your aunt, or like somebody that somebody that you could have that relationship to, maybe you also extend that trust back, and you lend them that ride, right? So that's something very small, but I think shows the magnitude and the depth of like connection and community that people have for one another. And so I think that's a consequence of surveillance and of this police state that people are not often looking at, but has this very detrimental and real effect on the bonds and relationships that people have in a community.
I don't have a lot to add. I think what I have noticed is that, and it took me a while to figure this out when I first came, is how to fit in emotionally and maybe intellectually, not so much because of physical appearance, but just I could not quite grasp what the culture was about, how I was supposed to behave, which was quite different to the behavior of my generation in Uruguay. And I think for us who come from Argentina and Chile and Uruguay, countries that have had such a huge influx of European populations, and so we have such a diversity of appearances, it's easier in some ways at times for us to blend in physically, but it's just as hard for us to blend in, well, with language, with customs, with family traditions, with all the things that can be so different.
To just speak to question of surveillance, but also the physical and mental violence that it perpetuates. Yes, as Muslim in so many ways, the state, and since the September 11, in many countries, Muslims have been labeled as terrorists and the larger communities, and there's always, of course, alienation and othering of Muslims in general. But then as a queer Muslim, it's also, I live at this borderlines of the tourist and the faggot. So it's like when I am in the Muslim communities, I'm labeled as a faggot. When I'm not in the queer, among the Muslim communities, then I'm a terrorist. So navigating those very fine lines of violence that continues in our lives as queer, as Muslim, as having these double and triple lives, it becomes quite exhausting at certain times. But also, to Ayaan's point, it goes beyond the physical and emotional violence. It really raptures and breaks those bonds that you have with people and the trust that you could possibly create. And it also takes away that even the idea of creating home, because then home for us becomes nowhere in so many ways, because we can create homes around Muslims for being outcasted, or as seen our sexuality as deviant, but then we also cannot create that home, of course, with the larger outside Muslim communities, even within the queer communities, because queer communities in so many ways have been continuously racist and also Islamophobic in so many ways. So how to navigate that fine line has been quite exhausting. That's why when I lived in Minneapolis, we started the Minnesota Caravan of Love, which was trying to address the state violence and surveillance on Muslims in general, but also on immigrant communities, but at the same time address homophobia that happens within the immigrant communities, but particularly Muslim communities. And that's, again, we are approaching June, and I wish I lived there, and I was there to do that march and protest on the streets for that reason. But surveillance is something that is very, very tactical of states, and it's very strategic in the ways that it actually has been implemented, creating and seeding distrust and mistrust in the communities, so that they are even scared of their own shadows, that they're even scared when they go to sleep or wake up among their own loved ones. And that's what is happening now, that in so many Muslim communities, that trust.
You froze.
Okay, sorry. In Kabul, there is something that they had put in 20 years. The US had put something called the Eye of Kabul, which anywhere you would go, it would surveil you. It would take your pictures. It would send information outside. And anywhere you would go, it would just be like as if like this machine in the sky was looking at you. And that's how surveillance has been in our lives for generations now.
That's a lot.
And I will say it's also extends to the surveillance issue, but what's been happening recently particularly with Asian Americans, is in light of COVID, is high amounts of anti-Asian hate, right?
Yep.
So whether it is surveillance, it is this blaming of other that then has people extremely, right, fearful. Ayaan's piece around trust. Not only that, but then there will be a misinformation campaign that happens as a result too, which further confuses community members, right? It's one thing when it's like blatant, racism against particular groups, right, in either case, but that's also the result of just increased distrust of immigrants overall.
Qais, you mentioned the Caravan of Love. Is that a formalized group or?
It's not a formalized, but in so many ways we did so much work but we didn't want it to make a formalized like group, then it just loses its community aspect of it in so many ways. But now other people are taking it on. So they do a lot of work with queer Muslims, with immigrant communities in general, but they also do a lot of gatherings around special months like Ramadan. They were doing gatherings, and now during the Pride, they will do another march during the Pride week for queer and trans Muslims. So it's a group that really is based on community and based on people who are living in Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Oh, it's pretty nice. And you're also making me think of how, excuse me, we did talk about the ways that you and your loved ones have found to help you feel like home. Someone mentioned, I think it was you, Tessa, during the planning meeting, coming together around food and around indigenous religious practices and rituals and things such as that. So could you each talk a little bit about ways that that you have found to help each other feel like home?
Well, since you mentioned me, yes, I think that for the Uruguayan community has been, if anything, the most important way for us to come together and eat traditional foods, cook traditional foods, and speak Spanish. Which some of us, some people speak better than others. Some have kids born here who are not speaking Spanish very well. And that's something that's a bit of a challenge for others, but we all accept that we're doing our best to pass on. But I think, yes, the traditions of food, eating the things we grew up when we're used to, and make them the way they were made back there. And that helps us tremendously to several times a year get together and do that.
I mean, I think for Hmong folks, we from day one, we knew we had, I think as a people, we always had each other, right? So we definitely have always practiced, for those who practice the indigenous shamanistic and animist practices, it's still ongoing, right? In fact, it's grown so much, it becomes an industry, and such as, we tend to butcher chickens and cows. And so there's whole entire butcher shops that cater to our practices. And so we, you can, anywhere where you go, you can take the Hmong folks out of, Laos, Thailand, but you can't take them, the practices out of us. So we, even it comes to in my own household, like last night, my husband made a traditional kind of dish that my kids grew up eating, right? And so when they eat it, there's dishes you eat that just remind you of home. So it's, how do we keep those traditions ongoing? And food is definitely that way of how we keep that tradition alive, right? And so and who made it for us, and the memories there. So I also love that a lot of our events, because of the density, we do things like and I'm glad out of COVID, we'll be celebrating the annual soccer tournament again, right? Hmong New Year, events like that where we get to come together as community. And for a lot of people who come from maybe areas where there's not a lot of Hmong people, they always want to come visit, because when you're there, you realize the power of the density when people come together. So I think the one thing that I think we will never leave us is this ability to come together and practice in those ways.
Yeah, to speak about food, food gave me a sense of safety and home when I was back home as a queer child, because I would always be finding myself in the kitchen where all the women were, and they would be in so many ways protecting me, or my mom, my sisters. And so when we had guests, that's where I would end up trying to help them. At the same time, like, I wanted to be safe there, because I knew that if I would be outside the kitchen, I would be in so many ways expected to be in a men's space, and there I would be bullied or I wouldn't be accepted fully. So I would always be in the kitchen helping or making things that they would tell me to do. And with that, I found a lot of love with food, and also a lot of comfort and the making of food. So when I moved to Minneapolis, that's the first thing that I, in a way, returned to my skills that my mom and sisters had given in me in cooking, and the art of that, and the love for making Afghan food. And that really brought so many friends around, because when you're in college, most people wouldn't know how to cook or cook good homemade food. And so I would do that, and I would invite people. And that's how I made friends, and that's how I created a community. It was always around food. So then I realized that this is interesting, that back home I found that safety around food, and here I'm doing the same exact thing, because home is now so far away from me, and to create that, I need to revert back to that food, to that kind of smell of kitchen that my mom would create, or the smell of home that my mom would create through food, that people would come around, talk, and love each other. So food has been very integral for making the community, but also creating safe spaces in general for immigrants, but also for queer people, because food really brings us together in so many ways. Because when we are not loved in our own homes, in so many ways we create those chosen families, and then we create food so that people can come together and feel at home.
I think music does that too. Sorry to jump in, but
No, go ahead.
music and movement and dances do that as well,
Mhm.
bringing one together.
Yeah, I think everyone made some really good points. The only other thing I would add to that is food is that comfort, but it's also that medicine. And so when we lose the language or traditions that have been passed down from elders, we sometimes lose that gateway to understanding food as a medicine and something that's healing. And there's that knowledge of when somebody's sick, your grandmother tells you to drink this type of tea or to eat this type of food or prepare it in a specific way. And so that knowledge is very, very valuable, and that's a part of that culture, the comfort that comes with it, but also food used as a healing and a medicine and a tool for health. So that's one part of that.
Yeah, that's very, very true. So Kia has suggested that if anyone in the audience has a question, that you go ahead and put it in the chat. I would also like to invite you, if you wanted to turn off your mic and ask the question, you can raise your hand and we'll go ahead and call on you. And I have one more question for the panel while you're formulating your questions, audience members, and that is about globalization. We had talked about globalization. That was a pretty big conversation. And I'm wondering how globalization has affected the people in your community. Ayaan, would you like to start?
Sure. That's a pretty big question.
I know.
To bite off
conversation.
Right. To bite off a chunk of that, I'd talk about how the internet has globalized the relationships I think people have with each other, extended a lot of, especially for for the younger generation, around jokes and memes and different things that they can relate to being in the third culture, being able to share that with each other, share stories. For everyone else, and including young people, tools like WhatsApp or Remitly, or like the way being able to send money from your phone and different things like that. That's a lot of people to stay connected and to hear and see from each other without, maybe some people haven't seen each other in decades, or being able to hold a loved one or experience the same food or be in company with them. So I'd say in that sense, technology has sort of opened up access that people have traditionally lost when being displaced, when they're displaced and are cut off from those ties to home and relationships with family.
Oh, I second that social media comment. I think it's brought us a lot closer, you know, and to the point where it's, you know, you see trends, and especially I appreciated the comments about music, because you see, you know, how, you know, the Hmong identity is being interpreted if for the Hmong folks who are still in Laos, for example, right? And so, and how they're incorporating things like hip hop into like their music and styles and dancing in their music. And so, which I'm always fascinated by too. It's allowed us to get closer. It's also allowed us to have these cross conversations about what is happening with language and culture that's evolving. There's a lot of critique around social practices. It's absolutely fascinating, I think, what that's done. I also, from the social media, globalization itself, it's been really interesting, because what we're seeing now is a lot of Hmong Americans who are actually investing in Laos, right? And so, you know, which is absolutely fascinating to me, like helping their families buy land and build homes. And so therefore really helping create actual economic engines. Now, to the extent of which that's helpful to the environment is very questionable, because climate change and all, you know, and environmental practices. But I'm starting to see that a lot more. And I think that what originally was remittances back in the day for food and for housing has really grown into broader investments. And so it'll be really fascinating now, you know, like as that gets a little more sophisticated, how that's going to be happening.
Well, I was thinking as we were talking about communication, that when I first came to the United States as an exchange student, I was 16. And for the whole time I was here, I didn't speak once to my family in Uruguay because long distance phone calls were so expensive. Yeah. And so I didn't want them charged to my family that I was living with, and my family in Uruguay couldn't afford them. So how different it is now that in just an instant you can talk to someone, send them a message, get a message back, you know, it's just so different now. And I'm not sure what's better or worse. I have no judgment about that, because it's so totally different. I think in some ways it helped me to become a little more independent, because I didn't have that family that I was in touch with all the time. But I had another wonderful family here in the United States. Now, if I had not had a good exchange student experience and may have perhaps been with a family I did not get along with so well, I think that would have been extremely difficult, not being able to call. And
well, I'm really grateful for the technology. I have a granddaughter. She's actually here, who lives in Chile. So we get to talk on Zoom and Facebook and FaceTime and all that, which we wouldn't have been able to do without this technology that we have today. Yeah. Qais, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, as I'm listening also, I teach on globalization, and I teach it to my students and tell them that globalization is like this bitter and sweet pill that you swallow in so many ways, that it is because of globalization that we see wars in my home country and Syria and Palestine, Somalia, and many parts of the world. It is because of these power dynamics that shift because of globalization and borders in so many ways that get so contested.
Okay. We have a question from the audience, from actually my granddaughter from Chile. She says, for those of you who spent a lot of time in your home country growing up, do you feel that your memory of your home country has become romanticized since leaving, or has changed over time somehow? How has living in another country affected your idea of your birth country? What a question. That's a great question, you guys. What's your response?
Well, I would say definitely. I think the more I missed my country, the more I remembered all the good things about it. And the things that really had been fun and heartwarming and all of that, as opposed to perhaps things I had not noticed as a young woman that were not so positive. But yeah.
It's really fascinating because as a second generation, the stories, I agree with Tessa's point about you only remember the good times, or you remember what was, you do only remember the good times, and these are the stories that then get passed down, right? And so about when it was peaceful and the things that contributed to that, you don't, and so as second generation, you tend to hear these stories and you think, oh, well, it was this idealistic place and time. I think it's the way the United States starts to want to think about the 50s, right? And it's like there wasn't problems with racism or, what white flight was doing, right? It's the same thing where suddenly you're like, we need to hear more nuance. In fact, it's not just memory, but it's practice. Sometimes at family parties, we still do these traditional dances. And my cousins from Laos and Thailand were like, oh, those are old school. And then I was like, oh yeah, it's 2022 there too, by the way, right? Right. So not only are they bringing memory, but practices. And so they that really get caught up. It'd be like if someone just, well, I mean, people now still, just got caught up in a certain fashion phase and never got out of it. But it's because that's the time, that's the time they remember, and they remember.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow. Ayaan, you were born here, right?
I grew up here for the most part, so I really can't speak to the back home.
Yeah. What about you, Qais? Can you?
Yeah. Home for me has been always, within me all the time. So I always have had this beautiful memories of Afghanistan, but I went back after 10 years last year, and because I didn't have documents to travel for a long time. And then when I went back, it was also that throughout time, you also generate certain things about it in your mind. You become much more fearful because everything around you tells you that home is not safe. There's so many things that could go wrong. And when I was there, all of those things went away. And it was all because I was so familiar with everything. And it was interesting to see that my own memory was so livid and so alive. When I just went everywhere, I knew how to navigate the city without even being there for 10 years.
Wow.
And that's also because we keep home so close to ourselves, especially when we have lived our early days and most of the time we have lived teenage days in our homes.
Okay, and there's another question from Kia. How do you grapple with the challenges within your own community?
I'll take a stab at that. I think earlier, I opened up the session by reading a poem about Hmong girls and women and the patriarchy. And I think that's still very much a lot of the issues we contend with, right? And so how women are still treated like second-class citizens, even in community, like professionally I'm referred to by my name, but with my husband's family, I'm referred to as wife of Chang, mother of, by my children's names. And so there's a certain way in which we, and that's just how we're referred to, but the way we oftentimes women are still treated, is still very much a real thing. And I think the way we address it is by talking about it and trying to do that meaning making and practice and say, you know what, it's okay because, like women, how we treat women and girls too, right? For example, I mentioned going to graduation. All the graduations I've been to recently have been of Hmong American women who've been finishing college, medical school, PhDs, right? And so it's really saying too, like the women are also, operating through mainstream systems of education and being successful. So how do we have this dissonance, right, of both, being very highly educated, and then the patriarchy still very much at play in a lot of communities, like and also being cis het too, right? And so that's really real, and we still have to talk about these things in our community. Actually, for a long time in our community, Qais, we didn't have a word for a queer person, right? And so, and friends of mine in the Hmong LGBTQ movement have been really trying to come up with a word to actually name themselves.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, she clarified the question by asking, what are some of the challenges within your community? And then how do you grapple with them?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier the tension of that exists between multiple identities and experience of being Muslim and also queer, and that really becomes challenging because I love my Muslim community in so many ways. I want to be part of it, but at the same time, in so many ways, queer Muslims have a hard time of speaking about homophobia because they know that the community cannot distinguish between homophobia and Islamophobia and then that perpetuates Islamophobia about on the Muslim community. So in so many ways, then we are silenced. And so that, again, the responsibility goes on the queer community. If the queer community was not so Islamophobic, we would have been addressing homophobia within our communities in so many ways, right? So it's a very like double-edged sword. So when and how to speak and when and how to be silent. And so that all becomes much more challenging when you have multiple identities and you're also close to so many different communities within your own community.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Anyone else want to speak to this question? And it doesn't look like we have any more questions.
Yeah, Carolyn, I just wanted to add too is another way I think people are trying, I think our young people are really pushing for change in the community. I think there's a number of leaders who've been trying to say we need to change practices, right? And the way we recognize women, the way we recognize our, queer or transgendered folks in our community. And so it's slow moving. And so I really do at 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But I do really admire a lot of our young people and other leaders who've long been advocating for these changes, right?
Go ahead, Kia, you had a
Yep.
comment?
Thank you all so much for this conversation. You all are so inspiring. And just thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate your candor and vulnerability in your responses.
Yeah, and I second that. It was a very inspiring, stimulating conversation. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, and we'll be in touch. So thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate this conversation, you guys. Wow. All right.